Tom Hiddleston's Loki in the Marvel Cinematic Universe is a fan favorite character, sometimes even outshining the strongest Avenger, Thor. A version of the comic book character first appeared in 1949, though weirdly as one of the Greek Olympian gods. It was not until the 1960s that the writers developed Loki into the more familiar character inspired by Norse mythology. According to this new lore, Loki was the son of a frost giant and later the adopted son of Odin and raised with his adopted brother, Thor. Eventually he grows into Thor's arch nemesis, spending most of the time trying to kill Thor or trying to usurp the throne of Asgard. But other times he's a gray anti-hero. But who is Loki? Not the Loki of comic book lore, but the Loki of Norse mythological lore. To help us answer this question, I've teamed up with a scholar and YouTuber of Norse mythology, Dr. Jackson Crawford. I started by asking, what are our primary sources? Where do we learn about Loki?
The Scandinavian countries were largely converted to Christianity by about AD 1000. Earlier in some areas, later in some, but that's a pretty good, easy to remember watershed. But we only get written literature about the gods, actual narratives about them, after the conversion. Apparently, in oral tradition, these stories are surviving in Iceland for about 200 years. And we have someone, we don't know who, these manuscripts are almost never signed, who decides to write down effectively a random playlist of about 30 poems, which concern the pre-Christian gods, Odin, Thor, Loki, and then pre-Christian heroes who were often of divine descent. And that is called the Poetic Edda.
So our first source is the Poetic Edda, what Dr. Crawford calls a mixtape of about 30 poems that circulated as oral traditions hundreds of years earlier, but were set into writing around the 13th century. Dr. Crawford has made a translation of the Poetic Edda if you're interested in reading it for yourself. The second source is the Prose Edda, a collection of Norse myths composed or compiled in the 13th century by the Icelandic chieftain and scholar Snorri Sturluson. Snorri's Edda is partitioned into several sections, but the section called Gylfaginning in particular contains some of the most complete and dramatic stories. The scholar of Old Norse literature, Anthony Fox, calls it the most extensive and coherent account of Scandinavian mythology. Snorri must have relied on earlier sources when writing his Edda, considering that he cites versions of the same poems that appear in the Poetic Edda.
He's the closest thing we have to a primary source for a lot of the myths. And otherwise, where we do have the same myth preserved in the Poetic Edda, which of course we always prefer because it's the direct poetic language of earlier centuries, he's so closely paraphrasing or quoting it that we're confident that when he presents myths, he is not trying to overinterpret them. He is trying to present them basically neutrally.
So those are our two sources. These compendiums contain the most famous stories from Norse mythology, the Norse creation epic, the adventures of Thor, as well as the story of Ragnarok, the prophesied end of the world when most of the gods die. Loki features prominently in both of these texts. According to Snorri's Edda, Loki has interesting parentage. Unlike the Loki of the comics, Loki in this text is the son of a goddess named Laufey and a giant named Forbauti. Now, the classification giant here is kind of confusing. It's a gloss for the word Jotun, which really should not be translated as giant.
In the last couple of years, I've come to kind of prefer calling them anti-gods. They don't tower over the gods, they're not a different species. They intermarry with the gods all the time. They're a rival family that's actually really tangled up with the family of the gods. We do ourselves a disservice with this with the way we translate it as giant. So I'm always kind of trying to work around that and say quote giants or anti-gods or just use the Old Norse term Jotun because it really can put you in the wrong frame of mind for thinking about them.
So Loki's father is a Jotun, which does not refer to big blue humanoids like the frost giants in the Marvel movies. Nor does it refer to big grotesque beings like how giants are sometimes portrayed in fairy tales. Loki's mixed parentage is very interesting. While his father is a Jotun, his mother Laufey is part of a different, more prestigious race called the Aesir, which includes some of the more prominent gods like Odin and Thor. And this is probably why Loki is known as Loki Laufeyarson, taking the name of his more prestigious mother rather than his Jotun father. His mother's lineage must have passed on to Loki because Snorri categorizes him as one of the Aesir.
A Jotun mother, it's not even worth mentioning because all of them have a Jotun mother. But Jotun father is really different, and we notice that Loki is one of the two examples of that I can think of off the top of my head. And he's generally just called the son of his mother. and his mother is the goddess, right? So that's identifying him with the higher status being. And of course, names in this culture, it's not like you register them at the courthouse, right? You know, your last name is not a legal reality. It's a description to help you know who someone is. So you could call yourself the son of your mother rather than the son of your father if that was advantageous, and apparently it is for Loki.
So that's his parents, but what about the rest of Loki's family? Loki's wife is Sigyn, with whom he fathered 2 sons. But Loki also fathers a few more monstrous children with the Jotun Angrboda.
And this demonstrates the kind of non-Mendelian genetics that's very common to myths around the world, because their children are a giant snake, a wolf, and a half-corpse woman.
Non-Mendelian genetics indeed. Loki's giant snake child is Jormungandr, the wolf is named Fenrir, and the half-corpse woman is named Hel. You'll notice the callbacks here to the characters Hela and Fenris in the movie Thor Ragnarok, though in the movie Hela is Loki's evil stepsister and Fenris is her animal sidekick, rather than Loki's children.
This gets a little confusing if you know this mostly from something like Marvel, because Marvel and a lot of other popular culture kind of divide Hel from her realm. So Hel is the realm of the dead, but Hel is also the queen of that realm. Sometimes in Marvel you see her called something like Hela, and the realm called something like Helheim, but those terms aren't actually found in Old Norse. They're the same thing, same name. So Hel is supposedly, according to Snorri's description in the Prose Edda, she looks half flesh-colored and half the color of the dead. This has led most artists to imagine her as half corpse, half living. That probably is what's intended, although we don't actually know if she's split, horizontally or vertically.
So you'll notice from his bio in the Prose Edda that the Marvel movies basically invent a new backstory almost from scratch. Laufey in Marvel is his father and is a frost giant, while Laufey in the Eddic literature is his Aesir mother. But one thing the MCU does get mostly right is his characterization. Snorri's Edda says, Loki is pleasing and handsome in appearance, evil in character, very capricious in behavior. It further describes him as cunning and possessing tricks for every purpose. And throughout the Eddic literature, Loki indeed lives up to the epithet trickster god. But how does his trickery play out in the Eddas?
We say trickster, and maybe in a 2021 context, we think of that as someone who's, kind of a con man, right? Who has like really elaborate plans and fools you and manipulates you emotionally. These trickster figures are often a little plainer than that, right? They're just liars.
For example, in one story found in the Prose Edda, a Jotun forces Loki to trick the gods out of magic apples that give them immortality when they eat them. So Loki goes up to the goddess Idun, the keeper of the apples.
It's no elaborate plan. He just says, hey, Idun, there's some even better apples outside the gates. You want to go see? It's like, she has apples that literally keep you youthful forever. It's like, oh, but there's better ones out here. Come look. Bring yours. It's like, So she does, and she ends up getting kidnapped by this eagle, which is one of the Jotuns. He's got maybe a persuasive charisma, but he's not a detailed manipulator.
Sometimes he plays his tricks as a shapeshifter. In the poem Lokasenna in the Poetic Edda, he transforms into a salmon to evade capture. In another story found in the Prose Edda, he transforms into a female horse, which enables him to be impregnated by a stallion and give birth to Odin's 8-legged horse, Sleipnir.
And that's a good example of how ambiguous he is, because of course, we're talking about a hyper-masculine society where, it's locker room masculinity, right? Anything you do to seem at all, immasculine is a mark against your reputation forever. And Loki does this stuff all the time, right? He turns into women, he turns into mares, he has children, right? Gives birth to children. Like he is like bisexual in serious biological terms, right? He is a man and a woman.
In other myths, Loki basically fulfills the role of a comic relief character. According to one story in the Prose Edda, Loki plays a game of tug-of-war with a goat, tying a rope to the goat's beard and the other end of the rope around his testicles.
What's strange is the way that he seems to use these talents for both good and for bad, right? So much of the time in the myths that we have preserved in the Poetic and Prose Edda, he's a funny sidekick to Thor. Right? When Thor finds that his hammer is missing, the first person that he calls up to help him is Loki. We have another story where Thor and Loki are traveling together and have just kind of buddy cop adventures.
But don't let the buddy cop stories like that fool you. In other stories, Loki is downright villainous and despised by the other gods. Let's take a look at the poem Lokasenna as an example, which is found in the Poetic Edda. In Lokasenna, Loki attends a huge banquet with the gods, but things take a turn for the worse right away. All of the gods were praising the host's servants for doing such a great job. But, as the poem goes, Loki could not tolerate hearing good things said about servants. So, Loki kills one of them in cold blood. The gods were outraged and throw him out of the feast, but he soon returns, and the story basically devolves into a public battle of insults. Loki stands among the gods in the banquet hall and trades surprisingly graphic insults with them. At the end of the story, the gods capture Loki and tie him up with the entrails of his own son. The gods hang a poisonous snake over him that drips poison on his face, and though Loki's wife sits there and tries to catch most of the poison with a jar, every time she moves the jar away to empty it, some of the poison hits his face, causing him to writhe in pain. This, according to Lokasenna, is the origin of earthquakes. But the climax of Loki's career as a villain comes at Ragnarok, the prophesied end of the world. One poem in the Poetic Edda repeatedly describes Ragnarok as a dark day for the gods, a day when brothers will fight one another and kill one another. In Snorri's Prose Edda, Loki will lead an army of Jotun and monsters in battle against the gods. In his army are Fenrir, the wolf, as well as the terrifying Midgard serpent. Snorri says that on Ragnarok, the Midgard serpent will spit so much poison that it will bespatter all the sky and sea. In this apocalyptic battle, many of the major gods in the pantheon are slain. Odin dies, swallowed by Fenrir. Thor slays the Midgard serpent, but staggers away and dies from its poison. Loki himself is foretold to fight against Heimdallr, killing each other in the process. The Poetic Edda paints a grim picture of the end of the world. The sun turns black, the earth sinks into the sea, the bright stars fall out of the sky. Thus ends the story of Loki, sometimes the funny trickster god, but ultimately a god who will hasten the destruction of the whole world, and will die in the process. But we've been discussing the Loki of mythology. If you're a fan of this channel, you'll know that religion encompasses way more than mythology. Religion encompasses cultic architecture, priesthoods, and rituals, everything from large-scale public rituals like sacrifices or collective prayers, to small-scale ritual practices that an ordinary person might do in their daily life. Mythology is a tiny slice of religion. So what about the religious practice surrounding Loki? Have historians and archaeologists identified a cult of Loki, using the term in the technical sense of religious veneration? Should we even expect such ritual practices for a morally questionable character like Loki? Unfortunately, the evidence for pre-Christian Norse religion is very sparse. The Poetic Edda and Prose Edda give us a glimpse into the Norse pantheon of gods, as well as conceptions of the beginning of the world and its destruction during the events of Ragnarok. But these texts provide only the slightest hints about all of the other facets of pre-Christian religious practice. As the Nordic archaeologist Anders Andren says, in the Eddic literature we are given a detailed description of the pantheon, but paradoxically very little knowledge about how people related to these powers. By comparison, when it comes to Greek mythology, we not only know a lot of myths about Zeus, Ares, and Athena, but we also have a ton of data about the religious practice surrounding these gods. We know what their priests looked like, we know the prayers that people chanted for these gods, and we know what religious practice was like both in public temples as well as in domestic contexts. But when it comes to Loki, we have nothing approaching this level of detail. Now, there are a few archaeological objects that may represent Loki. For example, what you're looking at is the so-called Snopton stone.
And what it is it's a large rock used as a shield for a man working a bellows at a smithy. So it's got a hole in the rock. You can stick the bellows through and work them, but be shielded from the heat. And the hole in the rock is made into a man's mouth with a large ornate mustache. But the thing that makes us think it's Loki is his mouth is sewn shut.
According to a story found in the Prose Edda, Loki's lips were stitched up after losing a wager to the dwarf Brock. But objects like this tell us precious little details about religious practice. They only tell us that Loki was not simply a literary figure, but he also extended into visual media as well. Any cult of Loki that may have existed is all but invisible to modern archaeologists and anthropologists. No temples, no priests, no festivals, no records of Loki-centered sacrifices or prayers. And even more striking, no places are named after him.
So we find all over Scandinavia and in areas settled from Scandinavia, Iceland, Greenland, the Faroes, place names with God's names in them. So most commonly it's Thor, who is the most popular god, the most accessible god. So we have more than 1,000 places, Thor's Harbor, Thor's Valley, Thor's Acre, etc. There's a fair amount of Odin, Odin's Acre, Odin's Valley, something like that. There's some very obscure figures that we don't really know well from the myths, like Ul, barely mentioned in the myths, but he must have had more prominence than we realize because there's many places named after him. But among all these places named for gods, there's not a single one named for Loki. One thing that I've privately wondered is, do you have kind of a distinction between gods who are very important in narrative and myth, and then gods who are very important in ritual? And do those not overlap very much? Right? It's possible, for example, that Ul, who in the Eddas we really hear about as just someone that you swear oaths on, is he very ritually important, and that's why we see him in all these place names, but just not narratively important, right? Not a participant in a lot of myths. Possible, but who knows? I don't want to walk too far down speculation. But it's very noticeable there's nowhere named after Loki, and there's no people named after Loki. There's a lot of people named after Thor.
So to summarize, many places in Scandinavia bear the names of Norse gods, but not Loki. Now, of course, as I said, maybe we should not expect cultic practices or veneration for a god with villainous qualities like Loki, any more than we would expect to find veneration of Satan in Christianity. But even in early Christianity, we do see religious practice that at least aims to counter Satan or mentions him in prayer. So the lack of ritual practice referencing Loki is kind of striking. One way that we could get at religious practice indirectly would be to examine the Poetic Edda as performative literature. The historian of Old Norse literature, Terry Gunnell, argues that the Eddic poems were essentially works that were presented live by performers and received by audiences visually as one-off living performances. He says that reading the Eddic poems just printed on a page is no different than examining the equivalent of a dead butterfly pinned to a board in a museum. So let's take Lokasenna again as an example. Remember, this is the poem found in the Poetic Edda that basically is a public roast of the gods, with Loki and the other gods trading insults. If we view Lokasenna as an oral performative text, we can speculate that people impersonated and dramatized their gods, which I'd categorize as some sort of religious performance. Now, of course, dramatizing Lokasenna would blur the line between religion and entertainment, or religion and theater, but I'd argue that religious communities worldwide blur this line all the time, and it's not really out of the ordinary. Although religious practice involving Loki is basically invisible to scholars, archaeological and textual sources have provided some data about pre-Christian Scandinavian religion in general. I won't go into all of the details. For those of you that are interested in this, you should check out Jackson Crawford's excellent overview on pre-Christian Norse religion. But generally speaking, we do have evidence for some sort of religious functionaries that we might call priests or priestesses. We have evidence for sacrifices and sacrificial feasts, and we have evidence that specific places and buildings were marked as sacred and used for ceremonial purposes. For example, between 2000 and 2004, archaeologists uncovered the remains of an impressive timber structure in southern Sweden that has been identified as some sort of pre-Christian ritual building, maybe some sort of temple. Dating between the 500s and 900s, it had been built and rebuilt 7 times over the centuries, and it contained a bunch of archaeological finds that suggest some sort of cultic activity, including animal and human bones from possible sacrifices, as well as over 100 gold foil plaques with human-like figures.
There's some archaeological sources. There are sites that were probably places of worship. One of the most notable that I point out is a site called Lunda in Sweden, where there is great evidence of a lot of burnt offerings, of clay, which were probably little statuettes, and then little figurines of hanged humanoid figures. And of course, we read of human sacrifice by hanging, and Odin himself sacrificed himself to himself by hanging himself. It's a whole other subject, but that's potentially real.
In short, we know a great deal about pre-Christian Norse religion, but the points of contact between the mythology and the religion as it was practiced on the ground remain mysterious, and Loki's near-complete absence in the archaeological record remains puzzling above all. Thus, the Loki that we know and love remains largely a figure from mythology, earning his place in history as the quintessential trickster god. If you'd like to learn more about Loki specifically, or Norse mythology and culture in general, please head on over to Jackson Crawford's channel. It's amazing. Say hi for me, and especially buy his translation of the Poetic Edda. I've pinned an affiliate link in the comments below. As always, thanks for watching.